Hi. Today I'd like to talk about the hot topic of the moment, which is the new diplomatic relations between the UAE and Israel, which are causing quite a bit of commotion in the region, with talks of all of the different possible implications of this new relationship. The normalisation of diplomatic relations between the UAE and Israel has been touted as a great stride towards peace in the Middle East. But while Israel and the Emirates have had an informal cooperative relationship for many years, the official establishment of diplomatic ties certainly goes a long way to spread regional acceptance of Israel, which should help ease tensions. However, there is another angle to this development that has not received too much attention yet, and that's that the UAE has suffered a series of setbacks to their image in recent years. The escape of Princess Latifa and subsequent capture and attack in international waters on a US yacht, the participation and involvement of the UAE in Khashoggi's death in Turkey, and the escape and divorce proceedings of Princess Haya, the child custody hearings in England that followed with Sheikh Mohammed, that outlined the kidnapping of Sheikh Shamsa from the United Kingdom soil. These are very high-profile cases of wrongful detentions and legal abuse that Westerners and other expats have seriously damaged the UAE's reputation globally. It's not just princesses and Emiratis and locals who are experiencing these sort of human rights abuses. It's Westerners, it's Americans, it's British, and soon to be Israelis. The UAE's attempted military influence in Libya is in tatters. Investment projects in Somalia have been a disaster, and their rivalry with Qatar has failed to effectively disable their tiny neighbour. The UAE's involvement in the war in Yemen has not yet brought any success, but has resulted in top Emirati officials being accused of war crimes. Things have not been going very well for the UAE. And what we've seen over the past, 10 years really, but even more so in the past few years, is the UAE's escalating attempts to whitewash themselves as a wonderful and attractive business and tourism destination. These things are sort of, a glossy magazine cover, but inside the magazine we're seeing something completely different. And that's really what we have to look at here. Is the UAE invests a lot of money and a lot of resource into public relations and lobbying, and that's lobbying in Washington and London as their primary areas of interest. So that's into press, it's into government, and it's creating the image that the UAE is in fact a Western allied nation. But at the same time, we're seeing these grave violations of international law taking place right in front of our faces. We're seeing an attack on a US yacht. We're seeing Princess Haya's testimony. We're seeing, women being kidnapped from the streets of England, and threats made against US citizens, against British citizens and foreigners to falsely put them on Interpol, to kill them, to arrest them, to torture them. These are the kind of serious allegations that are actually happening in litigation right now in the US and the UK. That's allegations of torture of foreign citizens within the UAE. So this is the kind of country that is inside that glossy magazine, that facade. And that's really the concern here, is that normalising relations with Israel is another attempt to whitewash the terrible reputation that the UAE actually has. The last thing we need in the UAE right now is greater impunity. Our fear is that the US may be more inclined to look the other way, and by extension encourage other Western nations to look the other way. When the UAE mistreats the citizens or behaves in a belligerent manner, simply because normalisation with Israel is so appreciated. And that's something we need to ensure doesn't happen. That when an American national is arrested and faces persecution, as we have right now, Daniel Jeffries, What we don't want is the US government or our Western governments just turning a blind eye and not getting involved. They have already stepped back enough with other incentives like security deals and mutual enforcement agreements with the UK on commercial matters. We're already turning quite a blind eye to a lot of belligerent behaviour from the Middle East. So what we don't want is an increase of that ignorance, essentially, of what's going on. And we mustn't forget that the UAE organised a joint military operation with India to attack a US-registered yacht. Now, that's a very serious violation when you think about the possible ramifications of setting precedent that that sort of behaviour is okay. If that is okay, and now with formal relations with Israel, is that really going to increase the UAE's lawlessness? I mean, not only that, we've had Israel's security officers head over to the UAE to conduct further security talks. One thing that the UAE has come under fire for is using Israeli operates to actually target American and British nationals for security surveillance, for hacking. And this is something that's happening against human rights activists, against litigants who are taking action, for example, against a UAE entity or a ruler, or claiming compensation through a foreign court. Now, this UAE using Israel to spy on Westerners is something that's going to become a lot more common now, and that's definitely something that needs to be brought to the public attention because it is unacceptable. We overall commend the normalisation of relations with Israel as a step towards peace, but it mustn't come at the cost of safety, security and human rights of our citizens residing in and visiting the UAE. I was asked today by an Israeli journalist what my advice would be for Israelis in wake of this new agreement, whether they would be at risk if travelling to the UAE. And of course, every foreign national is at risk travelling to the UAE, and that will especially apply to Israelis who might be more likely at this time to be excited to invest in a new country, to travel to a new country. And this is a country where you can be arrested for simply making a Facebook post and saying horseface. So, and not to mention the numerous investors who have been jailed in the UAE, who have been robbed of their money and their investments and falsely accused of crimes, detained for lengthy periods of time without charge and without evidence against them. Thank you for your question there on coronavirus. I'll come back and talk about that in a second broadcast. But I just really wanted to issue a warning, essentially, that this needs to be closely monitored and that we absolutely need to ensure that the UAE's influence in the West doesn't increase while we're still seeing these human rights violations, while we're seeing this escalating belligerent behaviour of violating international law, attacking US yachts, threatening foreign citizens and telling them that they can actually come to a Western nation and do what they want. They can kidnap them, they can arrest them. These are still the kind of threats that we're getting. And we also have rulers of country being accused of grave human rights violations, including torture, and we have litigation ongoing in the UK right at this moment that alleges that torture has happened in the Ras Al Khaimah prison against a foreign national, and that involved a US-UK law firm who have been accused of the torture by facilitating the human rights abuses. Now, this is the kind of country that uses foreign entities, whether that's a government, whether it's a private firm, whether it's a security agency, and it's certainly something that we don't want to see Israel supporting. We don't want to see Israel being used as a tool for these human rights abuses or as an extension of this terrible behaviour. So anyway, we'll keep a very, very close eye on this. Hi, Rodrigo. Good to see you. Hi. And thank you very much. I'll speak to you soon.